الحمد لله عظيم المنة وحافظ الدين بأهل السنة، نحمده وفقنا إلى الهدى حمدا كثيرا ليس يحصى عددا. وبعد حمد الله إني أشهد شهادة الإخلاص ألا يعبد بالحق مألوه سوى الرحمن من جل عن عيب وعن نقصان، وأن خير خلقه محمدا من جاءنا بالبينات والهدى، رسوله إلى جميع الخلق بالنور والهدى ودين الحق، صلى عليه ربنا ومجدا والآل والصحب دواما سرمدا. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So my dear brothers and sisters, we are here now inshallah for this blessed gathering and good session, a very important lecture about الترخص في الفتوى بين التساهل والتيسير والتلفيق بين المذاهب, invoking exemption between being too lax and too strict, the principle of combining between schools of fiqh, and some matters relating to this topic, important topic that all of us as imams need it. It's a very important matter and a very important and valued researches was presented in this important topic. Among those, some important, inshallah, we have our great scholars, Dr. Abdul Bari Mash'al, and Dr. Jamal Zarabuzo, and Dr. Walid al-Munisi, and Dr. Hatim al-Hajj. A very important matter that all of us need, and I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to fill this gathering with more blessing and to help us to apply what we learn from what to apply in our daily life. As you know that the most important, it's not to collect knowledge, is to apply this in your daily life to worship Allah Azza wa Jal in a proper way. And I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to bless our gathering and to help our mashayikh to offer it inshallah on the right way. Inshallah, we will give the presentation inshallah for Dr. Abdul Bari Mash'al. فليتفضل مشكورا منا مأجورا من الله عز وجل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. في البداية أتقدم.
Beginning, I begin with great thanks.
في البداية.
In the beginning, I begin by thanking to AMJA, specifically Dr. Sarah Hassawi, for allowing me to speak in this opportunity, this yearly opportunity for me to come and speak. And we hope that this can be done every 6 months. A year is too much, too long. Well, we wish to see everyone more than once a year. And thanks for Brother Sadiq that gave us ice cream and gave us some strength. You know, we were about to lose our battery, but we hope that we'll have some strength because of this the rest of the day. Our topic is issue of following easy fatwas, following licenses. In my paper, I will summarize the way I'll try to summarize my paper and the paper of Dr. Walid al-Manisi. Dr. Walid al-Manisi, he wrote a matn. He wrote a primer, and primer is not to be summarized. So I hope that I can give it its full rights while summarizing it. The issues that his paper talked about, in reality, they end to one issue. And combining them in one issue is an amazing way that he was able to combine them and great effort. This is from these issues are all interrelated issues. The ones who study these issues, he understands that they are very difficult and very cloudy, very not easy to understand and traverse. And what you used to think is haram, after a while you realize it's halal. And in these papers, I don't think that we will need we will come to a definite conclusion with these papers. We might need to go to master's and PhD effort to actually come to a conclusion on these very difficult issues. And the council gives its final declaration that represents a step forward in defining these issues. And and these issues are the one, like we mentioned, are interrelated, interconnected, and difficult to traverse. Number one, the issue of patching and following, patching between madhabs. Number two, following licenses. And the difference between a license in the Shareeah or a license in fiqh, asking one Mufti and then another Mufti, acting upon weak issues. All these issues were mentioned in Dr. Walid al-Manisi's paper. And I added the issue of dealing with deviant opinions and its harm on the ummah and acting upon weak hadiths. The first issue, the issue of patching between madhabs. The issue of patching, it's a branch from doing blind following, taqleed. And it ends to two issues. The following two issues. Following the licenses and easy issues. These three issues, patching and following licenses and making easy opinions, all these three end to another. They lead to one another. One of them ends to another. Patching leads to licenses and leads to easiness. And the regulations are similar and interconnected. And the opinions about them are similar in the councils, and shows that they're all connected and related. With regards to patching, the most famous example is that a person wipes only part of his head according to Shafi'i madhab in wudu, and then he leaves after wudu and touches his wife. And his wudu breaks. And so he instead takes the opinion of Abu Hanifa that his wudu doesn't break. So his wudu is based on two madhabs. But according to one madhab by itself, it's invalid, and according to the two individually. But together he made them valid by patching them. What is the ruling of it? Dr. Walid al-Manisi said, in summary, ijma was cited on its impermissibility. Ibn Hajar al-Haytami. And then he says, but it's not correct ijma because there are some ulama who allowed it.
ونقل عددا من
and he mentioned them.
في جوازه. الاجتهاد المعاصر
Contemporary ijtihad in this issue of patching
قد نص
it mentions
على هذه النتيجة التي أمامكم
that this conclusion that's before you, and that is,
مستخلصة
and it is derived
ومتطابقة تماما إلى ما انتهى إليه
to what Dr. Walid Munisi, Dr. Muhammad Zuhaili mentioned in his book Al-Wajiz. Talfiq between madhabs is that a person, a follower in one issue, in two different issues, in one act, in two ways that no ijtihad said are allowed. So talfiq is a person puts together one act of worship from two opinions or more that one individual ijtihad didn't say is allowed. And it becomes easy if it allows things that are not permissible. It becomes a form of ease. In reality, this issue is very difficult to make. International Fiqh Council said that talfiq, patching, that leads that no mujtahid ever said is invalid. This is they said that patching that is invalid is this type. They said it leads to following the licenses. This is contemporary ijtihad on this issue that didn't allow it. Well, what is then permissible patching? Permissible talfiq? Permissible is that we do in more than one opinion in different issues. For example, Dr. Muhammad Zuhaili, if he makes during Asr he makes wudu based on one madhab, and then during Maghrib he makes wudu on another madhab. In reality, contemporary ijtihad, they placed a principle, and I don't believe that we need to stop at only the example of wudu, but we have to do ijtihad in understanding the reasons. When contemporary ijtihad agreed that talfiq that leads to that no mujtahid ever said is not permissible, then we have to understand understanding the reason and what is the reality that of doing talfiq in one issue and not two issues. So some who believes that no, this two issues is actually one issue, and some said that this issue, no, it's only one issue, not two different issues. And in my opinion, this is why there's difference of opinion on this issue. For example, when you read to some of the scholars when they talk about talfiq, patching, as Dr. Walid mentioned about the fatwa of Ibn Taymiyyah, so he mentioned the fatwa of Ibn Taymiyyah, the issue that he allowed one woman, according to the method of Shafi'i, her tawaf is allowed, and another based on Abu Hanifa, her tawaf is okay, and another one on method Imam, another one, so on. But is this not the picture of that people are differing regarding? The issue, what they differ on is the issue of one particular instance and issue to one person. So this is we have to understand the circumstance and the reasons of why it's prohibited. We can't say that talfiq is what we just mentioned, and then say and then mention examples that are not related to what we mentioned the definition of talfiq is. From the issues of talfiq, of patching, shortening the prayer in travel, and the time limit of travel. Many of the contemporary scholars that I traveled with, And this is different than what I took from my father who's Shafi'i. He would shorten in prayer less than 4 days, or 21 prayer. He would shorten and combine. The Hanafis shorten for 15 days. So some of our sheikhs, our contemporary sheikhs, I found that they would shorten and they combine for 15 days. So I was like, this shouldn't be right. This is different than what I was raised upon. So they said these are two different issues. The distance of travel is one issue, and combining and joining is another issue. So Abu Hanifa is one didn't allow combining, but it allows to go up to 15 days in shortening. So he takes this from Abu Hanifa and takes the combining and shortening from the other imams and joins it. So here he joins and combines for 15 days. This is called patching in talfiq. But is it with regard to one issue or is it with regard to two issues? Clearly, the one who allowed it said this is in two issues. And these are also in big councils. These scholars are in big councils who initially did not allow talfiq in one issue. So they consider this form a talfiq in two issues. And so that's why he allowed it. For example, patching in contracts. The issue of contracts is a big issue, and business transactions is a big issue in patching and talfiq. It's not necessary that every contract has patching in it, but some contracts there is some talfiq, there is some patching, and from the most famous of that making profit based on promising a buying and someone buying it for you, then you buying it from them. Imam al-Shafi'i mentioned it, and Muhammad ibn Hassan mentioned it, with the condition that there is a choice for the one who made a promise. He can go back if he wants to buy it from the one who bought it for him, or he might not have to buy it. It's up to him. But to contemporary ijtihad, that no, in the Maliki opinion, they took from the Maliki. They said a promise is binding religiously, and also in the courts in these type of contracts. Or he used the issue of harm that happens for the bank, that if you were not to make this promise binding. And so contemporary ijtihad allowed it, even in these contemporary councils that did not allow talfiq. So this type of joining and patching, clearly we are in between two different opinions on this issue of talfiq, allowing and not allowing, and is in one issue or two issues. But we have to really understand, is this in one issue or two issues? We have to study this more. So the door is open until we can decide this. And this issue needs a lot of effort in understanding the reasons and circumstances when we can do talfiq. The second issue is regarding following licenses. And this issue is like talfiq. Following licenses, the name itself makes you think it's something bad. But fiqh is a scholar who's able to give you a true license, make your life easy. Fiqh is taking a license from a trustworthy scholar. So it's not necessarily something that's bad. There's a form of it that's bad, and there's a form of it that's good. It could lead to easiness, and that's a prophetic guidance and way. So what is the bad form of this? So we talk about So people sometimes talk about something generally. No, we want to apply it. So we want to talk in about something specific. When we say following the licenses is that a person to take from every madhab that which is easy upon him in all issues. And there's some of that's allowed, some of it's not allowed. So following license can be allowed and not allowed. When it's allowed, it causes ease. Dr. Walid and Manisi said, the ijma has been cited on this issue, but it's also not complete ijma because he decided that taking licenses is allowed when there's a need. What is the forbidden form of this? That which is not allowed in following licenses is leaving off any obligation, not having any obligations. By taking the way out from every madhab, he takes the opinions that allow him to not have to do anything. But using the easy opinions, there's no problem with this. But as a disclaimer, I think that it's better. I think that it's better that that's not always his norm, always taking the easier opinions. But if he's in a tight spot, or if it leads, then that would be allowed. But if it leads to ending up staying away from all responsibility, then that would be not allowed. And so, Ibn al-Qayyim, he mentions that what type of is allowed. He mentions some hadiths during the time of the Prophet ﷺ that allowed certain licenses for certain acts of business transacts. That do you think is riba, the issue of dates, but the Prophet allowed it for ease. So he said that sometimes following licenses for ease is allowed. From the following way of following licenses that's allowed is that which repels difficulty, such as it's difficult for you to fast such that you cannot concentrate on prayer. So this type of hardship, you're allowed to use certain licenses to make your life easier. During this issue, there are some terms that we have to discuss, or that we should discuss. There is a rukhsa shar'iyya, which is against the norm. We have default rulings and we have licenses, like breaking or like shortening your prayers and travel. So the default in Shareeah is to do your prayers, and you're allowed to you have the license of shortening them. So this is rukhsa in Shareeah. That's different than rukhsa in fiqh, in fatwa. So following the difference between these two, the allowed version and the not allowed version of following the rukhas of fiqh.
انتهينا من هذه المسألة. المسألة التالية حالة المفتي
Third issue is one mufti sending a person who asked him to another mufti to give a fatwa based on an opinion that's different than his own madhab. The summary that I came across, me and Dr. Walid Munisi, that it's permissible for the mufti that you're allowed to send a questioner to another mufti to give a fatwa based on another opinion if he knows that another person is more knowledgeable than you in general
في تلك
or in this
المسألة
issue.
خاصة وكان المفتي
And the
متبعا
Mufti is followed,
وكان المستفتي
and
أهلا
and the
للرخصة
person who's asking is someone who qualifies for a license.
ولا مجمع عليها
And it's not an issue that there's an ijma on or the explicit text. And if the other Mufti's madhab we're doing this to make it easier for him, and he has a strong madhab.
الأمثلة على ممارسات
And the examples of this from the scholars,
حديثا على هذا كثيرة جدا وكثير من الأمثلة تذكر بين الشيخ ابن باز
and many of them, the difference between Ibn Baz and Ibn Uthaymeen and our scholars in Syria, when one person would ask them,
يرون أن
and they think that their fatwa will cause hardship upon that person asking, they would send that questioner to another mufti to ask him to, because they know he would give him an opinion that would make his life easier.
أن له قولا فيه تيسير على هذا المستفتي وهي الغرض هو رفع الحرج والتيسير على المستفتي وقد ساق أخي فضيلة
Dr. Walid Munisi mentioned some examples on this.
على ذلك من العلماء الأقدمين ومجمع الفقه الإسلامي
And the Islamic Council in India, they agreed with this issue for need. And Sheikh Taqi Uthmani also allowed it for need and necessity.
وهناك أمثلة كثيرة
And there are also examples that you can go to in the research paper,
ولكن بهذه الضوابط.
but with these conditions.
العمل بالقول
Acting upon the weak opinion. Next issue.
القول الضعيف
The weak opinion. Fiqh.
يعني ذكر في
It's
أكثر
mentioned in more than one place.
من معنى لكن قصد به فيما نقله أخي فضيلة الدكتور وليد ساق ثلاثة أقوال
Sheikh Walid mentioned 3 opinions on this issue.
هو الذي يقابل الراجح
So the weak opinion is that goes against the more correct opinion. That which is against the more correct opinion, or the stronger opinion.
الصحيح الذي يكون مستنده من الدليل ضعيفا فيخالف القياس الصحيح
Not that which goes against the absolute text or ijma or strong qiyas, but we're talking about things that goes against the opinion that there's difference of opinion on, but it's the one that goes against the more stronger one.
دكتور وليد بأنه يعمل به لنفسه أو يعمل به لنفسه أو غيره أو لا يعمل به ولكنه رجح في النهاية أنه يعمل به للحاجة والذي انتهيت إليه في هذا الموضوع
What I
القول الضعيف
mentioned that the weak opinion is that which doesn't have a strong opinion, evidence, and a person should give a fatwa with a stronger opinion,
ويعمل به عند الاقتضاء من ضرورة أو حاجة
and only can act upon the weak opinions during certain conditions and circumstances.
ويعمل به عند الاقتضاء من ضرورة أو حاجة بشروط مقررة وعند وجود مصلحة أو الإفتاء به للمضطر والقول الضعيف يتقوى بقضاء المجتهد ومما ذكره الشيخ النبي في هذا الموضوع
And Sheikh Nubayah mentioned that if the leader of a country picks an opinion, then that becomes a stronger opinion for the country.
فهذا من ما ذكروه في هذه المسألة. أما القول
As for the weak opinion that goes against the correct opinion in terms of going against the explicit text and the ijma and the qiyas and so on, clear qiyas, we'll get to this later when we talk about the issue of giving fatwa with a deviant opinion. Here, I mentioned an example for the weak opinion that I mentioned for you based on this definition. This example is an opinion of the European Council of Fatwa in terms of buying houses with interest in America and Europe based upon the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa. the issue of allowing dealing with interest in the lands of other than Islam. And Sheikh and Dr. Salawi corrected me, and he read my paper, and he gave me some advice. I accepted his opinions. We're not going to say what with Europa mentioned in this time. Maybe in another time, there was an environment that maybe there weren't enough Islamic banks when there were opportunities to do that, to help mortgages. Nor do we see that non-Muslims and Muslims are different in terms of need and necessity. Need and necessity are general evidence that can be applied in here and can apply in the Muslim country. So we're not going to distinguish between them. Nor is the West need a specific opinion. As for the opinion of Abu Hanifa, with regards to this issue, it was discussed. Dr. Wahab al-Zahiri talked about it. Sheikh Dr. Muhammad Zuhaili, and that the Shareeah does not change. Its rulings don't change based on because of the place, especially with regards to the necessary matters, the clear matters like riba.
هذا الحكم يترك أثرا سلبيا على غير المسلمين وهو أننا هذا الرأي مبني على أننا نستحل أموالهم.
And this actually gives us a bad image with non-Muslims because this opinion allows us for us to take their money in riba. Even though, and that's why we deal with them, people will think that this gives us a bad opinion in front of the non-Muslims. And some people in some states, they use this opinion in terms of stocks and so on without following. Difference between the opinions that we can accept and the differences that we can't accept. Dr. Walid al-Manisi, he summarized the whole thing. He said, if there's a text that's clear in its indication and its authenticity, then there's no khilaf, there's no differences accepted, such as like mentioning certain numbers in texts. These are clear in authentication and indication. So ijtihad here with text is not allowed. As for other than this, then we can accept differences, like the opinion of Imam Shafi'i in al-Umm.
يعني أنا قرأت النص وكأن فيه سقطا أو كأنه صعب علي لأفهم سياقه فيما يتعلق ببعض.
There's a text with the example from Imam Shafi'i, so I hope that Sheikh Walid Manisi can talk about this text, this quote, because I think there's a part missing, or I don't understand the context. But so difference in opinion is allowed if it's not in going against a clear text. Because if there's a clear text and there's difference in opinion, then that person, if he gets the text, he should change his opinion back to the text.
لما قرأت كلامه تردد قصد الشارع وبين طرفين سحبت الورقة معناها انتهى الموضوع. طيب أنا أختم بهذا. تردد قصد الشارع بين طرفين. يقول كل من المجتهدين.
All mujtahids are trying to reach what Allah intended.
كل منهما يقصد إلى تبين.
All mujtahids are trying to reach that.
ذكرت كلام فضيلة.
But I mentioned Dr. Zuhaili, what he mentioned, that he said that differences in fiqh, we liken it like different ways meeting to the downtown. So all these different routes, just like the difference, it becomes easier to get to their destination. So the differences in fiqh it's the same thing in trying to reach the same destination. So this is mercy and allows us flexibility in the ummah. That which is not allowed or accepted, I add to what Dr. Lead mentions. And a very important point. Now, I don't want to get into the different branches with regards to the opinion of the council, but I bring with the most important example, and that is going against that which is certain. Obviously, we don't accept it, but that which, the difference between what people think that there is no clear text, but in reality there is. And they think that they're going against, so in reality they're not going against each other, so we have to clarify these positions, when we're actually going against each other and when we're actually not. Some people think that there's different opinions not allowed here, or the different opinions allowed here, based on they think maybe they're not talking about the same issue. So we have to understand that we have to clarify what exactly we're discussing, the opinion at hand, or the issue at hand. So they might, fight, and it's like a war erupts. But in reality, they're each talking about something else. Each one person is imagining and talking about a different topic, and in reality, they're not even talking about the same thing. So we have to make sure that the issue at hand is one. Well, the time is over. And maybe I'll continue later during the comment section.
نشكر لفضيلة الدكتور عبد الباري مشعل هذا العرض القيم العلمي لهذه المسألة الهامة جدا، مسألة التلفيق بين المذاهب عند الضرورة والحاجة وجوازها عند العذر، التي استفدنا منها كأئمة، ومسألة إحالة المستفتي إلى مفتي آخر. بارك الله فيك، جزاك الله خير الجزاء. إن شاء الله ننتقل الآن إلى العرض الآخر مع فضيلة الدكتور جمال زربوز، إن شاء الله فليتفضل مشكورا مأجورا. بارك الله فيك.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. So I see I already have the red light, so I better hurry, I guess. Okay. First of all, a couple of apologies. You'll see that I'm using this big computer. I had a small computer for presentations, but the hard drive crashed, which means Bitcoin owners beware, because that's going to be the end of your Bitcoin if that happens to you. Secondly, I told Brother Sadiq, I'm not a fan of PowerPoint presentations. In fact, I think 2 AMJA conferences ago, in a footnote, I explained why PowerPoint, I don't think it's a good way of presenting material. And furthermore, listening to the first lecture, I completely changed now my lecture, because, why should I repeat what the first lecturer has said? So you can just completely ignore anything that might be showing up on the board here. So let me begin, inshallah. First of all, Sheikh Hatem, in his paper on the renewal of Islamic discourse, he has touched upon this question of using weak positions. He actually has a heading called The Utility of Weak or Unauthorized Positions. So let me, inshallah, present what he has to say, because if I leave it to the end, I might forget it, and that would not be very nice of me, inshallah. So he says that, even if we consider an opinion weak, it may be sometimes adopted to relieve hardship, provided that it meets certain conditions. And then he lists the traditional conditions that are mentioned by our the condition or the opinion is not too weak. It has been attributed to some mujtahid in an established sense, and the person is under duress to follow that opinion. And then he said we can also add a couple more where the person is not seeking concessions. And he also states, later he also talks about the fact that, or he says the majority of scholars qualify that statement to mean that one may take an easier position of a qualified mujtahid if it spares him or some hardship, but may not simply select every easy position he or she encounters. So in other words, there has to be a reason driving the individual to choose an easier position. And then he also talked about talfiq a little bit, pretty much some of the same. What is talfiq? What are some examples of talfiq? He pretty much mentioned some of the same points that was mentioned by our speaker. And he also adds another point that if you know with certain knowledge that something is faulty or wrong, then you have no excuse to follow that. And he quotes Imam Shafi, reminding us that it is our obligation to follow. If we know something has come from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, it's our obligation to follow it, and it's not permissible to turn then to anything else. So he touched upon the issues very briefly in that paper, and I hope that's a fair summary of what he had to say. I have a very different take, as much as I hate to disagree with my roommate. I may not be able to get back in the room, but I have a very different take on these issues. And basically, how does one come to a situation where he's going to choose, quote unquote, an easier position? And I think the starting point, we have to remind ourselves what is a fatwa and what is the purpose of a fatwa. So a fatwa, if you go to the definitions that scholars have given of a fatwa, one thing is very clear, that the Mufti is informing the one who was asked the question, he's informing that person the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on the revelation, the guidance that has come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the goal of the Mufti is to give what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ruling about a certain issue. He doesn't have the conclusion in mind. He doesn't have what he thinks is the best conclusion. He doesn't have any subjective opinion on the issue, but he is trying to find based on the evidence in front of him, he's trying to find what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, or in other words, what does Allah want from the one who is asking the question to do in this situation. And we're all familiar with the book of Ibn al-Qayyim, in which he reminds us that basically the one who is signing a fatwa, the one who is giving this fatwa, he is signing on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Al-Shatibi also mentioned that the Mufti is like taking the place, he has the maqam of the Prophet ﷺ within the ummah. So this shows us that the job of the Mufti and what he's trying to conclude with, he is trying to find what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ruling, or what is the ruling of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on any particular issue. And in general, when you look at the books of Usul Fiqh, and also they talk about what are the qualities of a Mufti, they talk about the fact that he has the tools of ijtihad. So we're speaking about a mujtahid. A mujtahid is trying to determine what should, based on the evidence of the Quran and Sunnah, what should be his response to a given situation. And obviously, as given in the previous lectures, we know that one of the differences between fatwas and fiqh is that fatwa is responding to a particular situation or a particular question. So his goal, as I said, his goal is to find what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is demanding of that individual to do in this case. And as I said, this starting point is very important for us to keep in mind when we think about all of these different issues related to the question of fatwa. Secondly, also, we have to keep in mind some of the historical developments. Our fuqaha, our usuliyin, they did not write in a vacuum. There are historical developments that took place that drive some of the opinions or some of the guidance that they have offered. And given those constraints or given those situations, what they're offering may be correct under those circumstances, but doesn't mean it is a principle or a pillar that all of us, even under different circumstances, are going to resort to the same kind of point and make the same kind of conclusion. So for example, following rukhs, following rukhsas. It's a new English word, or a bad Arabic plural, one or the, whichever you prefer. Yeah, this is my job as a translator. So exemptions, right? By the way, there's Shareeah, as has been mentioned before. There are Shareeah exemptions. There are exemptions that are clear in the Shareeah. And like, for example, when you travel, you can shorten your prayer and break your fast and so forth. Even the Shareeah rukhsas, these established Shareeah rukhsas, there is an important question that the Mufti must deal with when it comes to these Shareeah rukhsas, and that is the question of, anytime we have a law in the Shareeah, anytime, for example, that any kind of ruling has come down from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Suppose, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a ruling concerning the female slave, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a ruling concerning a non-married individual, for example, committing zina. So for every ruling, the Mufti must look at that ruling, and for a new case, he must ask himself this question. So for example, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us, this is just a hypothetical, don't misunderstand me here. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us, for example, about what is the ruling of a zani who is not married. So now we have to ask ourselves, then the zani who is married, do we apply what is known as mafhum al-mukhalafa, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned one, so that implies that it doesn't apply to this other case? Or do we apply qiyas, or do we say, okay, that's the stated case, the illah is the same, it applies to this case as well? This is some of the thinking. For every law that you see, you are either going to apply it in a qiyas or a logical sense, or you're going to apply the implication of it in a mafhum sense. But to add to the difficulty is that suppose that law actually has an exemption to it. Now, if it has an exemption, so now we have the original law and exemption. So now when we have a new case, do we apply the original law? Do we apply the mafhum of the original law? Do we apply the exemption? Do we make qiyas on the basis of the exemption? These are actually some of the issues also related to those rukhsas which are founded in the Shareeah. And most of the scholars will say you can make qiyas on the basis of those rukhsas. I discussed it in more detail in my paper. But the issue, of course, that takes most of the discussion and from most people who write on this, of course, is the question of what they call following the fiqh rukhsas. And so even this concept, what is meant by following rukhsas? What is meant by following these kind of fiqh rukhsas? So these are not exemptions that are found in the Shareeah. Okay? These are now opinions that are found by, opinions expressed by scholars, and some of them seem very easy. So most scholars, when they're defining what is meant by following rukhsas, they define it as choosing from each madhab that which is the easiest to follow. Choosing that which is the easiest to follow. Now, I would hope that just based on what I mentioned earlier, that if we are talking about a mufti finding what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ruling concerning this, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want from us, to say, well, let's just find the easiest. I think it's very clear that this, as a conception, first of all, we have to ask, how did this even come about? Why would people even think about the idea it's okay just to go and look and find the easiest? And by the way, in the early generations, you can essentially find in ijma' all the scholars saying that it's not allowed to be seeking exemptions, to be following these easiest opinions. But things changed over time. So there was actually, many scholars said there was ijma', and then later scholars had a varying opinion. It's not that they went against ijma' necessarily, and it's not even that they denied that there was an ijma'. But sometimes when you face different circumstances, those different circumstances now require a different ruling. So, for example, behind this question of following rukhsas, we have to understand that there's lots of philosophical issues, and there's lots of historical issues which defined this question and why it came up. And when we seek to answer, we have to realize what are those issues and what are relevant of those issues today or not. So, for example, the question of, is every mujtahid musib? Is everyone who makes ijtihad, is he correct or not? By definition of the fact that he made ijtihad, if we are going to say that by definition of the fact that he's made ijtihad, that every position he has is correct, then we can look at any opinion and say they're all correct. If we end up with that conclusion that every mujtahid is correct, this can lead us to say, okay, then not a problem. If everyone is correct, we can pick and choose from among them. But of course, that opinion that every mujtahid is musib in that sense, meaning in that sense that they are correct and their opinion is valid, that is definitely a weak opinion. We can prove from examples from the earliest years that they did not accept everyone's ijtihad and say that everyone is correct. Even the question of taysir and raf al-haraj, these are also some of the reasons why scholars say it's okay then to follow rukhs. Right? It's okay now to follow exemptions because we have in our Shareeah, we have the concept of taysir. We have the concept of removing hardship. So this is a way of removing hardship. And this is probably one of the strongest evidences for the question or the concept of following exemptions, right? Picking and choosing from among the opinions that are out there and just choosing the easiest one. But it's very clear from the Shareeah that taysir, or making things easy and removing hardship, are not, in general, they are not goals in and of themselves. In fact, more than not, they are the results of following the Shareeah correctly. So we have plenty of evidence in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us that the concept of taysir is there. وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. Allah has not put any hardship upon you in the deen. But that's also the same verse. That's also the same verse that says, وَجَاهِدُوا فِي اللَّهِ حَقَّ جِهَادِهِ. Right? The verse begins by saying, strive in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as is His right. So if you're talking about taysir, looking at the evidences and yeah, the evidence says this, but you know what? Here's this opinion out here. Let's take what is easiest and give what is easiest in the name of this taysir. And Allah has not put any haraj upon us in the deen. That is after you are striving for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, exerting yourself in the way that is proper. Right? So for example, the Prophet ﷺ, as Aisha has informed us, again, the hadith that is often quoted in this context, the Prophet ﷺ would do that which was easiest if he had a choice. Yes, he would do that which was easiest if he had a choice, مَا لَمْ يَكُنْ إِثْمًا, as long as it wasn't sinful. So first you have to define what is acceptable from the Sharia point of view. Once you define what is acceptable from the Sharia point of view, if you have many options now in front of you, then there's no harm whatsoever in choosing. And in fact, you can even say it's the sunnah then to choose what is easiest. But after you have verified that these are all options which are pleasing or acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it doesn't work the other way. Otherwise, as I said, the Sharia itself, it's built into the Sharia that Allah has removed hardship and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us taysir. But what happened historically? When basically the door to ijtihad was closed. And of course, there's a lot of, nowadays, there's a lot of discussion about what did that mean exactly. But in any case, we know that there were times in which it was very difficult for scholars to make ijtihad. They were restricted by their madhabs. They weren't free. I should say the scholars were not free just to look at an issue and make ijtihad. All the ijtihad was done. So since now all the ijtihad was done, in that framework, now you're just left with those opinions that have been out there from the scholars before us. See, one of the things that you'll find often when it comes to this question of following rukhs, and even Majma' al-Fiqh in their conclusion about following these exemptions, they say that if there is haja, right? If there is need, then you can follow the rukhsa. You can follow this exemption. You can follow this easier opinion if you have some need. In other words, if there would have been some hardship otherwise. But this goes back, you see, this goes back to our historical situation where the individual was not free to make ijtihad. And that is why he invoked this opinion, and he said, I'm invoking this opinion to remove hardship from you, and I'm following this exemption. I'm following this rukhsa. Instead of saying, look, here's your situation, and I am a mujtahid. And given your situation, there's some possibilities in the Sharia, X, Y, and Z. But I can see that X and Y, for example, are not suitable in your case. And there may be many reasons why X and Y are not suitable in that person's case. So instead of invoking this principle of following rukhsas and saying, there's that opinion out there, it's a weaker opinion or whatever, so I'm just going to invoke it just to make things easier for you. That is not giving, as I said, the fatwa. The Mufti is supposed to be giving and explaining what is Allah's ruling on this. But if his ijtihad leads him to say, in this situation, this is what the Sharia wants from you, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you. I'm not just invoking an opinion because it's out there and I can invoke a weak opinion on this circumstance, but I'm saying that the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for you in this case is this. This is when the mujtahid is free to speak in this way, which nowadays mujtahideen are free to speak in this way. When they were tied to not being able to make ijtihad and they had to choose just from different madhabs, you know, when they had to choose from different madhabs and you found the opinion concerning following rukhsas changing from haram to permissible, you know, this was a great relief for the ummah. This was a great relief for the people that sometimes you find some opinions in some madhabs, they are both hard and wrong. In other words, they're not strengthened by the evidence. But in that period of taqleed and no freedom to make ijtihad, they were still forced to follow in that direction. So the way out was, okay, turn to this other madhab and choose that opinion. It's easier. We call this following rukhsa. But now in this time and day, there's no need to say, and al-haja, if there's need, you may follow rukhsa. Because by definition, rukhsa, you are giving the easiest opinion You are not necessarily giving what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from that person at that time. By definition, that's what you're saying. And so that means you're failing in your obligation of giving a fatwa. By definition. But if you are free then to make ijtihad, then you make ijtihad accordingly, given the circumstances of that individual. With respect to combining madhabs, talfiq, Sheikh Amdullah mentioned many points. Sheikh Hatim also in his lecture gave some couple of examples. And again, it's the same kind of concept here. Because at talfiq, you are combining madhabs, right? Because again, we are in this framework of madhabs. You know, a lot of so in one of my papers, I have a section on what causes difference of opinion among the fuqaha. Right? A lot of the differences of opinion among the fuqaha go back to usuli issues. Do you accept mafhum al-mukhalafa or not? You know, different issues related to qiyas and so forth. Do you accept ijma' sukuti? These are all usuli issues. These are all the foundation of so many differences of opinion. But mashallah, by the way, in usul al-fiqh, there was usually more freedom than fiqh to express different opinions. So you find even some of the Shafi scholars, well-known Shafi scholars, in their usul, they're choosing opinions that go against the traditional Shafi views. So with respect to the question of talfiq, again, the same kind of thing. If a mujtahid studies the issue and based either on his particular opinion of a certain usuli issue or something else, or based on his analysis of the hadith or rejecting accepting of a hadith, if he comes to a conclusion that one practice is right, and that happens to be the Hanbali practice, and another practice is right, another component is right, and that is, for example, the Hanafi practice, when he's free to make ijtihad, if that is based on his ijtihad, it's not based on trying to follow rukhsas or any other thing, or it's not based on trying to force a conclusion on something, but it is based on his true ijtihad, then there shouldn't be any issue with that. Obviously, we have to be careful about violating ijma', and that is definitely a tricky point with respect to this issue of talfiq. If you come up with some kind of combination that is not known to anyone before, yes, that's where it becomes very tricky. But otherwise, just coming to the conclusion that this is, by the way, you know I'm from California, right? So yellow means absolutely nothing to me. Even red is it's questionable. Red is only if somebody's coming from the other direction, otherwise it's a mere suggestion. So let me quickly, because what does this mean, like 5 minutes? 5 minutes, okay, so let me talk a little bit quicker, okay? You're gonna have to do it. That always works with college students, I guess not. This is an older group, doesn't like that. With respect to shadh, let me just say a couple words about shadh. Shadh, first of all, it depends on what you mean by the word, because it is used in different ways. It is used sometimes to mean go against the majority and so forth. But if you mean by shadh something that clearly goes against evidence from the Quran Sunnah. So for example, in ulum al-hadith, you have a hadith which is shadh. This basically means you can prove that this is wrong. This is not a sound. This hasn't been passed on in a sound way, acceptable manner. There's an issue or a mistake with it. So obviously, if there's an opinion which is shadh, meaning contradicting the Quran Sunnah, if it is the job of the or contradicting what is definitely affirmed and so forth, if that's your definition of shadh, then obviously there's no room for a mufti to turn to something like that to give his opinion and say that this is the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on that issue. The burden on the shoulders of the mufti is quite heavy. Lastly, with respect to using weak hadith, of course, one thing with respect to using weak hadith that I don't think has received the amount of attention that it deserves, and leads, for example, to the even someone like a scholar like Ibn al-Qayyim, saying that every madhab at some point they prefer weak hadith over qiyas and so forth. I think one thing that hasn't received the amount of attention that it deserves is the fact that the scholars of hadith grade hadith and determine acceptability of hadith different from the scholars, the usuliyin. In fact, the scholars of hadith describe hadith as either sahih, hasan, da'if jiddan, or mawdu', while the usuliyin in general, they talk about maqbool and mardud. And at least one researcher says one of the reasons why they say maqbool and mardud, because they don't want their view to be confused with the views of the muhaddithin. But in any case, obviously the muhaddithin are the specialists. They are the ones who are actually like on the ground. They really understand when mistakes are being made, what kinds of mistakes are being made. So I don't think there's any question that their judgment on what is acceptable hadith needs to be followed. Of course, there is a debate on using weak hadith, to what extent weak hadith can be used. With respect to the Mufti, you can ask yourself one very simple question. Weak hadith, basically, if you think about weak hadith, basically weak hadith is a collection of faulty data. It is data that is suspicious, that is not affirmed, and has some problems with it. So if your goal, inshallah, is to try to find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ruling on it, so one of the things that you need to do, try your best, is to make sure that your database is sound. And in order to do that, especially in fiqh, this means that you need to do your best to avoid those reports that cannot be affirmed from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wallahu a'lam wa barakallahu fikum wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Barakallah fiqh, Dr. Jamal. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you tremendously for your efforts and for this interesting presentation. And actually, I take this a chance to say to him, we love you for the sake of Allah, Shaykh Jamal. Nuhibbuka fillah. And actually, I really use the materials of Dr. Jamal Zarabuzo in our community to give it for the new Muslim converts, like sometimes CDs and books that he wrote. MashaAllah, it's very, very helpful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and bless everyone who attends this lecture. Barakallahu feekum, jazakum Allah khair al-jazaa. إن شاء الله نبدأ الآن الأسئلة كما يعني تعودنا. إن شاء الله سؤال من اليمين، سؤال من اليسار، ثم من اليمين ثم اليسار، ثم بعد ذلك إن شاء الله الأخوات. فإن شاء الله نبدأ بالدكتور. تفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بحث الصباح تحت أستاذنا فضيلة الشيخ الدكتور صلاح.
The paper that Dr. Salah mentioned, what should a common person do if he gets confused by the different fatwas he gets? Should we add a sentence that the muftis that give fatwa on their specific issues, as for general issues, they should go back to their imams in their mosques? As for issues relating to specific issues in your life, and you get different fatwas, that's what this paper is about. As for general issues relating to the community, people should go back to their imam. As for the issue of talfiq, or patching, the conclusion is that patching is and following license is allowed in necessary. So he said this isn't necessary with these two issues because everything is allowed in Sharia according to necessity. As for the issue about the European Council, with regards to the issue of interest and the opinion of the Hanbalis, they said this was not the only opinion that they were based upon. They used other evidences, and they used the opinion of the Hanafis and the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah as a collaborative evidences, and they add conditions to it. And we do not allow Muslims to use this. They put some conditions that you shouldn't use it in certain cases with certain banks, and sometimes you're allowed. So the European Fiqh Council didn't just allow a general fatwa, but they allowed it for certain circumstances. I think we should look back at understanding what the European Council meant.
لا تأتيهم النتائج الجديدة أو الإحداثيات الجديدة، تبقى آرائهم على الرأي القديم. بالنسبة للدكتور جمال and the expression he used when referring
As for
to
what
giving
Dr.
fatwa,
Jamal,
he said we are supposed to give people what Allah wants us to give. I know that he meant really well, but maybe according to our best of knowledge, maybe you have to be a little bit careful with the terminology, especially I don't think we are supposed to reach a right conclusion all of the time, but we are to be sincere and qualifying our approach. But no one knows what's really what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from us all of the time. And sometime we الحديث عن الفتاوى نتكلم عن الفتاوى
when we talk about fatwas and a warning against being easy in giving fatwa, we should be moderate. And the people, they should not take fatwa from other than the qualified, and they should not go to people that can't give fatwa.
بارك الله فيكم. من تعليق إن شاء الله. طيب تفضل.
As for the first two questions, those two questions are for me, is that correct? I didn't say that talfiq is allowed by necessity. I said I gave the definition of talfiq and said it's not allowed when it based on contemporary ijtihad. And I put what they said, not me.
في خاتمة البحث يا دكتور. في خاتمة البحث.
أنا قرأت البحث.
هذه في الخاتمة في التوصيات. موجود في التوصيات.
طيب إذا قرأت البحث يعني تريد أن تأتي بعبارة أو ماذا؟
أنا في توصيات البحث يعني.
It's at the end of your research paper.
هذه التي قرأتها في الباوربوينت هي التوصية، هي نص التوصية.
نعم.
هذا في توصيات البحث للدكتور وليد. الدكتور وليد المنيسي.
They're discussing about when is talfiq allowed. Is it only necessity or is it allowed for a need as well? And he said we shouldn't just say for necessity because everything's allowed for necessity. So what's the difference? So what is meant is not making talfiq only for necessity, but what is meant here that it's obviously better that if there's a necessity, then obviously we should use talfiq. Not that it's only allowed in talfiq, but if there's a necessity, then we should use talfiq. That's what's meant by what the researchers spoke about. But not that talfiq is only allowed during darura. The doctor said Dr. Uli may say no, mine was more general. I said talfiq is allowed not just necessity but for a need and when there's an excuse, things like that. When there's hardship, not just in necessity. As for the second issue about the European Council, their fatwa was general. And these are the things that we disagreed with them, is that it was a general. As Dr. Zuhaili mentioned, that necessity and need should be personal and not general. And Dr. Muhammad Zuhaili talked about that. Rather, it should be a personal case by case. But the fatwa European Council was general. And it went back to the opinion of Abu Hanifa and due to the issue and the principles of necessity in Islam. And Dr. Slahsawi, he has 100 pages discussing this fatwa.
أنا قرأت في حيثيات الفتوى المجلس الفقهي أنا قرأت البحث وقرأت بحث أستاذنا الدكتور صلاح. أنا هدفي ليس جدلي ولكن هدفي محاولة أن فتوى المجلس الفقهي الأوروبي.
طب نرجع هذا في المناقشة المفتوحة إن شاء الله. استاذنك
في جزء فنرى في فتوى المجلس الأوروبي يعني ربما تصدق في وقتها وعليها مآخذ في وقتها، ما كان يجب أن تصدر لعامة المسلمين وقد ظهرت سلبياتها.
So he's saying that I said that this fatwa had a negative consequence on the community because it was general.
أصبح الناس يملكون
Because
أكثر من بيت.
so people are now owning more than one house based on this fatwa, and it's not used just for specific necessity cases. This has become serious in the Muslims in Canada getting more than one house, so it's not being used for necessity.
فتوى المجلس
طيب،
الفقهي
معلش يا دكتور.
اسمح لي حضرتك انا اسف بس فتوى المجلس لم تسمح للناس ان يشتروا اكثر من بيت ولم تسمح لهم ان يشتروا
صحيح.
بيتا اكبر من حاجتهم.
صحيح، لكن صحيح
أي ده
هذا
شأن الناس
صحيح،
جميعا مع
لكن
كل العلماء.
ناقش الفتوى
إن شاء الله هنرجع
استدرك على عموميتها، أن عموميتها للعموم هي التي أدت إلى هذه التصرفات. أما لو انطلقت من أن كل حالة تدرس.
He's saying, I understand that the fatwa said you shouldn't do that, but he said because it was general, people are using it for that case.
إن شاء الله ننتقل للسؤال الآخر ونتابع
Next question.
With respect to what he said about what I said, if you look at the definition of
Sheikh Jamal said if you look at the definition, oh,
listed here,
I'm translating English.
all of them say essentially the same thing, that the Mufti is informing the people of the hukum of Allah, the ruling of Allah. So this is the goal of the Mufti. This should be his intention, and his intention should be nothing other than that. So, for example, in my paper I talk about what we call the secularization of Islamic law. Sometimes we start with the conclusion, and our conclusion is based on this system and where we are now. I think this is how the person should be, and then we work back to the evidence and try to find any fatwa out there that will answer this conclusion. And that conclusion also that we're usually trying to find, why I refer to it as the secularization, is that conclusion is human-centered. It's not Allah-centered. In other words, we're just looking at, as a human, what would be nice in this dunya for this person to have, or this for him to follow here. We don't want to cause any harm. We don't want to break up a family, for example. Well, if the Shareeah says the family is broken up, then it's not our decision. So we cannot go from what we want to make this situation to be when the reality is different. And the job of the Mufti, again, is to try to find what is the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala concerning that issue.
بارك
If you
الله
want to
فيكم.
come up with a new definition of fatwa, wherever you went,
جزاك الله خير.
that's your business. That is the definition.
دكتور محمد تفضل.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is about the last lecture, the religious discourse. Is this the right time or
The previous
ethic?
lecture, you mean? Or this one here?
So can I say the question? Thank you. Now, the question is related to application of the religious discourse. There will be some issues that need some clarification. I mentioned some of them. One of them is the language and the interpretation. So we're talking about religious discourse, Islamic discourse, American discourse. Even in the content, we talk about construction, reconstruction, adaptation. The word adaptation is not there. But I think the language will play a role in the way we understand the religious discourse. That's number one issue. Number two issue is how we will be able to interpret the reality. It's a foundation for the application. And here, are we going to get into empirical research, studies, or the text, or what? So we have challenge in this area. Another area is it from inside or from outside? Where we start? From inside the Islamic thoughts, how we consider the other thoughts, how we link both, is another issue. Fatwa also doesn't do with the past. It do with mostly with the future. How are we going to deal with that? Shukran. Assalamu alaikum.
وعليكم السلام. طيب حضرتك توضح السؤال. Is there any comments? تفضل.
First of all, I'm not sure if that was related to this lecture or the previous lecture. Yeah. But I would just like to say that, this is, obviously you're coming from a postmodernist perspective. This is not the time and the place to deconstruct postmodernism. But as Muslim scholars, we could easily do that in the appropriate time and place, inshallah. Otherwise, the response to your question would take up many, many minutes.
Were you asking about my paper?
Yes.
Okay. So.
And all, because they are all related, it's about change.
Yeah, the idea here, I don't want to disagree with Sheikh Jamal. I'm just saying that the idea here is that it is important to understand that the application, the application of the Islamic values, the Islamic value system is solid, and it is basically it is solid, but it is, when it comes to the legal framework, it is also adaptive to engage with different realities. The application in the different fields of human activity will be best realized when we combine knowledge of those fields of human activity, whether it's psychology, whether it is sociology, whether it is basically public policy, et cetera, et cetera. So the application will be, the best application will be realized when you have the masters of those fields of human activity combine the knowledge of those masters of those fields of human activity with the knowledge of the scholars of Sharia. If you do have one individual, the all-in-one, type individual, that would be great. If you don't, then al-majama' al-fiqhiyya, they always listen to input from the experts in different fields. Can we improve this? Yes, we can improve on this. Are we the masters of the different fields of human activity to begin with as Muslims? Do we have Muslims who master those fields? Not really, and we do need to get to improve. But we do count on the Muslims who have the best, basically, mastery of those fields for their input, and the final signatory will have to be the Muslim scholar, because the Muslim scholar will have to have the proper understanding of the reality and then apply the Islamic value system to that reality. But the final signatory does need to be eventually the Muslim scholar. If the Muslim scholar does not basically receive sufficient input from the masters of those fields of human activity, whether it is corporate ethics, whether it is public policy, whether it is bioethics, et cetera, then the Muslim scholars did not do his homework before he issued or she issued his or her fatwa. So that is part of the answer. Some of the other questions may take much longer to be answered, so I'll just stop here.
بارك الله فيك دكتور، جزاك الله خيرا. إن شاء الله نواصل الأسئلة مع الأخ الكريم، تفضل.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. When discussing talfiq, it was brought up about when you combine opinions on a specific mas'ala or a specific issue that has consistent usul, like doing 15-day qasr with jama', there must be a tasawwur that a mujtahid would have held that opinion. So one of the opinions that was brought up was if there's self-contradictory usul that a mujtahid would not be able to hold, we should not be doing that talfiq. So my question is, when it comes to defining what is contradictory usul, how many imams who possess a degree in Shareeah would actually be able to identify that there is contradictory usul, and therefore they would be allowed to do that talfiq? To give you just a quick example to explain what I mean, the Ahnaf, for example, they have the principle of 1/4 being akthariya when it comes to wiping over the head. When it comes to the libas having 1/4 of najasa khafifa, versus the Maliki madhab, 1/3 is considered akthariya, and different madhahib have difference. So if one person were to take the principle of 1/4 as being akthariya on one mas'ala and then 1/3 as being akthariya on another mas'ala, they would become self-contradictory usul. So my question is, how many in your general understanding, how many people are actually qualified to do that? Is it like 90%, 10%, 50%? Just a rough estimate. And if the number is very, very low, wouldn't that basically mean that it's prohibited for most people who don't have that level to make that talfiq because they'd end up in contradictory usul, or they wouldn't even know where it would contradict?
حضرتك بتوجه السؤال لأحد العلماء.
الاثنين, Dr. Hatem and Dr. Zaragoza.
Well, I have to say one thing about talfiq, because talfiq was addressed, and the issue of talfiq and whether it is pertaining to one issue or two issues is, sometimes I wonder how could the same scholar who considers the cost plus sale for the purchase orderer permissible based on talfiq consider the example of wudu according to the Shafi'is and using wudu, the wudu position, or using the Shafi'i position in making wudu, and the Hanafi position in not nullifying the wudu, consider this to be unacceptable talfiq when the cost plus sale for the purchase order is talfiq between two madhabs in one contract. If any one of them will circumvent the objectives of Shareeah, it is the talfiq in the cost plus sale for the purchase order, not the talfiq between the Shafi'i position in wudu and the Hanafi position in nullifying the wudu. So I believe that talfiq would be prohibited, unacceptable, when it circumvents the objectives of Shareeah, because talfiq per definition should be in one issue, not in two issues, because if there are two issues, this would be tanaqqul. So it would be basically transfer. It would be moving from one madhab to another madhab. So if I make wudu according to the Shafi'is for Salat al-Isha, and next day in Salat al-Fajr I make the wudu according to the Hanafis, I made tanaqqul, I moved from one madhab to another madhab. But talfiq by definition, in my understanding, my humble understanding at least, should pertain to one issue. Combining the two madhab in this one issue, if it circumvents two things that would make it prohibited and obviously prohibited, if it circumvents the objectives of the Shareeah from this particular action, in this particular action or contract, such as marrying without wali and without shuhud, such as marrying without shuhud, without witnesses, and without announcement. In this case, you're actually, in fact, circumventing the objectives of Shareeah. But the other example would be to use shuf'a against your neighbor and then to deny shuf'a when your neighbor wants to use it against you, which is the example of the double standard. Aside from those two examples, I believe talfiq should be acceptable. I think Sheikh Jamal will disagree with me because he believes talfiq is acceptable in the first place, that I'm trying to defend talfiq because I'm trying to restrict our choices to the four mazahib, so I'm trying to make talfiq from within the four mazahib. And like I said earlier, I am saying that very rarely can truth be found outside of the four mazahib, but it could be found very rarely outside of the four mazahib. Yet, in order for us to regulate, to control the fatwa qiyas, I think that this would be where we should start. We should start from limiting the fatwas within the box of the four mazahib, and then within this box, talfiq would be in this case acceptable, with the conditions, the stringent conditions that I pointed out or I mentioned in my paper. The issue of dualisms is what is making us disagree to this extent. Dualisms. Human beings are always attached to dichotomies. Some people are dealing with the ammi. What is the ammi? We have a dualism, ammi and mujtahid. The ammi could be someone who people do ask sometimes, did Abu Bakr come first or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Some Muslims do ask, who came first? Abu Bakr was first or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? This is a ammi. And then there is a ammi who was only 2 nights from being a mujtahid, right? You reach a mujtahid at one point. Cut off. So we will have to address the Ammi who is 2 nights from being a mujtahid, and the Ammi who's asking whether the Prophet ﷺ was first or Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu.
أحسن الله عليكم دكتور، جزاكم خير الجزاء. إن شاء الله نواصل الأسئلة إن شاء الله. تفضل.
السلام عليكم. سؤالين سريعين. الأول خاص بالتلفيق.
The first question regarding talfiq.
It takes more than 4 minutes. The question is.
I'll be quick.
Okay, خلاص إن شاء الله. تفضل.
لاحظت في تعريف دكتور
طيب
عبد
لحظة.
أنا آسف.
تفضل يا دكتور جمال.
So first of all, definitely one of us is going to be locked out tonight. He didn't give a fair representation of what I talking about when I said talfiq. We're talking this meeting, right? It's talking about fatwa making, right? So everything that I'm speaking, I'm talking about from the point of view of the Mufti, the qualified Mufti. So now going back to that question, why did that Mufti, for example, say on this point 1/3 and on that point 1/4? He has to have some reason for why he's saying 1/3 here and 1/4. Again, it should not be just about these madhabs are out there and I'm just picking and choosing whatever I want. So if he doesn't have a reason to say 1/3 here and 1/4, that's the problem. So basically his methodology is not very strong. But if he has a reason to distinguish and say for this it's 1/3 and there's for 1/4, then that's fine. Because he can prove what he's saying, he has a reason, and that's not an issue then, inshallah.
بارك الله فيكم. تفضل.
يعني سؤالين سريعين. أول خاص بالتلفيق الدكتور عبد الباري. رأيك في التعريف
The question regarding talfiq.
على المذاهب الفقهية. يعني التلفيق الممنوع هو
Talfiq that is not allowed is based on determining, inventing a third position that the scholars never only went outside two.
ليس الأصل إذا اجتهد المفتي في الفتية هو إنزال الحكم الشرعي على حالة معينة. ليس الأصل هو موافقة آراء العلماء.
So, but wouldn't the job of the Mufti try to give you the right position even if it goes against the other scholars? Why do we have to be binded by the other scholars? Isn't it? What's the problem? What's the problem of coming up with a third opinion that's even more precise than the other two? Why it would be considered prohibited?
دكتور حاتم في تعليقه يعني أزال بعض اللبس، لكن حتى المسألة اللي حضرتك ضربت بها المثل الأول هو المسح على الرأس في الوضوء ثم لمس الأجنبية يعني لا توضح الأمر. السؤال الثاني هو حكم العمل بقول الضعيف. نفس
The issue about using a work opinion. Ibn Abdin, what's obligatory that you have to go on based on the correct opinion, not the weak. What about, however, the weak opinion is that which is better? So, like the 3 opinion talaq is more beneficial for the people. Why can't we do that? So what's the problem with looking at using opinions that even went against other opinions, but it's better in serving the purpose of the Shareeah?
يعني ليس كل الكلام كان واضحا، لكن كان اعتراضك على تعريف التلفيق في المقدمة. نحن
regarding the definition of talfiq,
تعريفات وكلام الفقهاء في التلفيق ومن ضمنه النص الذي قرأته.
we define talfiq, we reach a conclusion, condition that it was specific. So Allah, he said, a lot of the opinions of the scholars, no doubt we disagree with them, but at the end of my paper, I think that it is consistent. It's not inconsistent. I know we go against some of the opinions of scholars when we believe it's not consistent, but I believe my definition that I mentioned is consistent.
وكان اعتراضي في هذه النقطة على أننا أليسنا بذلك نقدس آراء المذاهب.
Brothers saying, don't we think that we're making the 4 madhabs almost divine if we can't go against them, if we think there's an opinion better than them? Especially if it fulfills purposes of divine obligation in the Shareeah.
رأي المذهب الآخر في الجزئية الأخرى من جزئيات الفتوى. زي ما حضرتك اتكلمت على مسألة السفر. ماذا لو رأى أحد الناس
What happens if why can't one of the scholars, in terms of talfiq, what's the problem if we believe that two opinions that he's combining, or both of them are the strongest in their chapters.
إذا كان هذا
So what's the problem with that if that's going to best fulfilling?
جيد بارك الله فيك. أنا هذا المثال ضربته على أنه ليس مطابقا لمفهوم التلفيق الذي تحدثنا عنه، لأنه في مسألتين وليس في مسألة واحدة. يعني هذا إذا جينا نحقق مناط التلفيق الذي تحدثنا عنه لا ينطبق على هذه المسألة، لأنه هي مسألتان وليس مسألة واحدة، مسألة مدة السفر ومسألة الجمع والقصر في السفر وفق رأي الشافعية والحنابلة، فهما مسألتان. هذا المثال وكثير، يعني أنا فوجئت الحقيقة، أسافر كثيرا مع العلماء وفوجئت بأنهم يعملون بها.
So he's saying, I'm using these examples that I mentioned to show that I believe it goes against their definition of talfiq.
كثيرا من العلماء حتى نسب للعالم المالكي السعودي المكي المالكي نسب إليه هذا القول بالجواز هذا.
بارك الله فيكم، جزاكم الله خير. إن شاء الله ننتقل للأخوات.
مسألة أخرى خاصة بموضوع الأخذ بالرأي الضعيف في المذهب.
طيب أخي الكريم، الله يبارك فيك، عشان الوقت جزاك الله خير. الدكتور وليد تفضل إضافة.
الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. فقط إضافة المسألة.
Sheikh Khalid want to mention that.
ماذا منع العلماء؟
Why does scholars not allow creating a third opinion?
كلام أخينا الكريم أن هذا تقديس لكلام العلماء.
Is this considered like making them the scholars divine? The issue not allowing introducing a third opinion. The summary of it is that we have two pictures. So one picture is that we're using both opinions that were already mentioned in a third. Like one in an issue, some scholars say it's obligatory, some scholars it's recommended. So a third opinion that comes that says that it's wajib sometimes and mustahab in other times, then this would be considered permissible, and there's no problem. As for the picture that's not allowed, is creating a third position that does not include this other two. For example, they differed. If an issue is wajib or mustahab, like a woman covering her face, a niqab, so fuqaha said either it's mustahab or wajib. So a third person comes and gives a third opinion that says it's haram or that's makruh. This is not using both of them into a third. So this type of picture, the reason why we disallow it is because it goes against the ijma'. The ummah, whether it differed, if something is wajib or mustahab, but it's agreed upon, there's ijma' that this issue is permissible, and it could be either obligatory or mustahab. There is a percentage of agreement here. But if someone comes with a third opinion that goes against them, then he's going against the ijma', that action is permissible. So this is why the scholars didn't allow this second picture.
هل في سؤال من الأخوات؟ Sisters, do you have any questions? طيب إن شاء الله نكتفي بهذا القدر. إن شاء الله يعني قد حصلنا على 15 دقيقة زيادة، فنسأل الله عز وجل أن يجعل هذا في موازين حسنات الجميع إن شاء الله جبالا من النور يوم القيامة. وأسأل الله عز وجل to bless our gathering. نسأل الله عز وجل أن يتقبل منا هذا العمل وأن يتقبل من أساتذتنا الكرام، وجزاكم خير الجزاء. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك، نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت، نستغفرك ونتوب إليك، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.